Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture 9 of web design and development, and in this lecture I am going to discuss about implementing cascading style sheets in your web applications. Briefly look at the lecture contents. In this lecture, basic concepts of CSS cascading style sheets will be discussed. There are different kind of styles, and there are different ways to implement these styles, and there are some font and text properties which will be discussed in this lecture, and then finally I will provide some introduction how to style elements. So if you study the CSS, it was created by Håkon Lie of MIT in 1994, and it corresponds to the W3 consortium standard for controlling the visual representation of the web pages. That means this is the standard benchmark for the specification of your web pages style elements. Cascading style sheets are a powerful mechanism to add styles to web documents, and it enforces the standards and uniformity so that all of your pages will have the same kind of web page layout and design elements. So it will also help you to create dynamic effects that you have seen in a number of websites, such as opening and closing of tags and other kind of animations to load or unload any content in your web page. There are certain advantages. Foremost and important one is that it saves a lot of time, and it is very easy to change one CSS file rather than changing each of the HTML documents. So if you specify the styles in one CSS file and you apply it to all web pages, it is very easy to manage and change the styles that will be applied to all website. So it will also help you to keep the consistency, and it will give you more control over the layout, and you can use these styles with the JavaScript, and it will make it easy to create the common format for all the web pages. There are different ways to style your web pages known as inline styles, internal styles, and external styles. Inline styles are referred as styles to each tag within the HTML file. So if you specify the style for each element separately, that will be referred as inline styles. So you can use it when you need to format just a single section in a web page. For example, if you just want to format one button or one heading or one paragraph for the web application, you can use the inline styles. Styles attribute is used to add the styles for any element. For example, here is a heading, header one element is used, and you can use the style element to specify the styles of that particular tag. We will look the syntax of the styles later. So for now, the way this style is presented is referred as inline style element. The another type is internal style. So if you want to apply the style to a whole page, you can use the internal style element, and it will be applied to entire HTML file. So you can use it when you need to modify all the instances of a particular element. For example, you want to specify the style for all the headings, all the divs, or all the paragraphs in a web page. For example, the similar style described above will be written in the same way in the uh, in internal styles. So it will be embedded with the style element tags, and it will be most probably placed in the header tag of your HTML page, and you specify with the name of the element, and then you have curly braces, and then you specify the number of tags. So this style element for h1 will be applied to all the heading 1 type of elements in your web page. or in your single HTML file. Similarly, an external style sheet is a text file containing the style definition. Use it when you need to control the style of entire website. So it is the most preferred and suitable way to style your web application. So external style is referred as a link to your header element, and it has a file that must be a CSS file and linked to a page. And the link is referred as a link element in the head tag, and it has a hyperreference element which specify the URL to the location of your CSS file, and then you specify the relation, and most typical relation is a style sheet for the cascading style sheets. And the type specify the link type, and usually the style sheets are text or CSS files. So let's look at the syntax of defining a style or a style element. So it is defined by a rule. A rule consists of a selector, a declaration, property, and a value. So rule starts from a selector. Selector actually specifies that on which elements your style will be applied. So it specifies the element or multiple elements to the declaration will apply to. And then we lead to the declaration part, which is specified by curly braces, and it have number of declarations. Declarations specify how the elements referred to a selector should be styled. For example, in this simple example, we have one declaration and it has a property known as in color, which specify the property of selected item, and then it has a value which is a specification of this property, and in this case it is referred as blue. So a typical style referred here has selector h1 curly braces of declarations, and it has a property color followed by a colon, and it has a value for the color that is equal to blue, and it ends with a semicolon. Semicolon is required if you have multiple declaration. However, if you have one declaration, semicolon is not needed. So this style will be applied to all the header elements, h1 elements, where you link this cascading style sheet. So more about the selectors. There are certain kinds of selectors that are used in cascading style sheets. The most common is ID selector. It uses an ID to distinguish something like a paragraph from the others in a document. The ID selector is used to specify a style for a single unique element, because ID is unique for all of the elements in a page. So you can create a style by ID selector, and you can use the hash attribute, and then you can specify the name of that ID for a particular tag, and then similarly you can specify the style attribute and values. So this style will be applied to any element that has the ID of the name specified here, your text specified here. Similarly, you can specify a class selector. In this way, you can mark a group of elements with a common identifier using the class attribute. So to create a class, you just have to name the class with a dot operator, and you can use this class to any of the element. So there are two ways to create a class. One is referred as tag.class. It will be applied to tag with the class attribute, and the other is dot class name. For example, we specify the class base as dot base and then curly brackets with number of declaration. And if we want to apply this class to any element, we specify the class attribute of that element and specify the class name here so that this style will be applied to any of the any of the elements that use this class name. Another important selector is a descendant selector, and it changes the element only if the element is placed inside any other element and not otherwise. For example, if we have a div element and we want to change the paragraph element in a div element, or a button element placed inside a paragraph element, and if we want to change this button element, and we can use the descendant selector only if the button is a descendant of a div element. So this can be done using a descendant selector, which is a group of chained elements. So descendant selector can be specified by an element name followed by a space and then specify name of the descendant. For example, in this case we have specified the element name div space and then element name button or input, and then we specify the declaration of our style. So in the slide example we have a header element and then a link element in the header, and we have applied color green to any anchors that are placed or descendant of heading elements. Similarly, a child selector is used to avoid chaining of selectors, and you can apply it to the direct descendant of your HTML element. Child selector change the element if element is a direct child of another element. So in this case you can see we have a div and then we have a paragraph and then we had a button. So div paragraph button, that means button was the descendant of paragraph, that was the descendant of div. So in other words, button was not the direct descendant of div. For the child selector, it is a necessary condition that the element must be a direct descendant of your parent element. So if we had to apply the same kind of styling here for the button element, we should have applied the rule such as paragraph to button, such as a similar case here. We have heading and we have a child, direct child of anchor, and we have applied the same style as above. So style can be applied to a specific element based on the attribute of element or the value of the attribute of the element. For example, you can apply the element style to anchors with which have the value of hyperreference is equal to index of index.html. So this style will be applied to all the hyperlinks who have the href of this typical value. Similarly, this style will be applied to all the hyperlinks which have the href value without considering what the value of href is. So you can use any kind of selector for your particular needs. Uh, so you can use the ID selector when any elements that are simply used once on a page, or you can use the class element to style website, but you have to use an element in the JavaScript. You can use an identifier of that element. There are other kinds of selectors such as pseudo selector, which are applied to additional attributes of your elements. For example, if you use the focus selector with any of tag, it selects the input which has the focus. So whenever the input will be focused, your this style decoration will be applied. Similarly, checked pseudo selector style will be applied when the checkboxes will be checked. Nth style will be applied to a number specified here by a value, and the style will be applied to that number of child of a parent element. Similarly, first line selector will apply style to only first line, and first letter selector will be applied to first letter of any content of HTML element. Before selector specifies the element and adds the textual content before those elements, and after selector specifies the element and adds the textual content after those elements. So here is an example. If you want to add some text after after a hyperlink, you can specify a double colon after, and then you specify content home. Style can also be applied using the attribute selectors. So some CSS properties are commonly used, which are discussed here. Number one is the font. Font properties allows you to control the appearance of text in your documents and to affect the font and its appearance. Common font properties are font family, font size, font weight, font style, font variant. Font family specifies the typeface or the family of the font that should be used. So it can be any font such as common fonts of Arial, Courier, Times New Roman, etc. Or you can install new fonts or embed new fonts into your web pages. Font size is specified in some metric, and it specifies the size of the font. The common metric is pixels or inches, or it can be relative from small, medium, large, etc. Similarly, font face specify whether the font should be normal or bold. There can be certain values for normal, bold, bolder, etc. Similarly, font style specifies whether the font should be normal, italic, oblique, underline, etc. Font variant specifies that font should be small, caps, uh, normal, or uppercase letters, or it can be a smaller version of uppercase letters. The text properties also have some other values such as color, text align, vertical align, text decoration, text transform, word spacing, letter spacing, etc. So text align, color is you are very familiar with the color. It specifies the color of the text, and the horizontal alignment of the text is controlled by left, right, or justify text. Vertical alignment can be from top, middle, bottom, etc. Text decoration can specify whether the text should be underline, overline, line through, or blinking. Word and letter spacing specifies the word space between the letters in pixels. So you can also style the links and the background properties. Links style when the element is a link and it includes a hyperreference. It also have some other pseudo structures such as visited, hover, and active. Visited is applied when the links are already visited. That means you have clicked the link. And hover is applied when you move your cursor on the link. And active is applied when your hyperlink is active. So here are typical example of AF link. If hyperlink is contains a hyperreference, it will be red, and if you have already visited the link, the color will be yellow. Similarly, background color can be also changed. It highlights as the link if the highlighted with the highlighter pen, Background image specify the image, and background repeat property specify that the image should be repeated or not, and position specify where the image should be positioned. So this specifies the background color should be pink and they should be image, there no repeat, and position at bottom. So you can also control the location of the elements. CSS provide a way to control location of HTML elements through the page. So it is controlled by the positioning attribute. Positioning can be absolute with the page or relative to other elements or page boundaries. So if you use the absolute positioning, your element will be positioned with respect to screen or the page size of your browser. And if you use the relative positioning, your element will be placed to the relative to the other elements. So if, for example, in this slide you use a div with the position of absolute location, and you specify that your div should be 80 pixels down from the top and 20 pixels right from the left. So if you specify two elements that have the same position, so there can be some overlapping. So in this case, you can specify another property called z-index, which is used to give the order of precedence. So most importantly, the CSS elements are uh, covered by the CSS box model from outer layer to inner layer. So at the outside of any element, there is a space called margin. So you can specify a margin element to actually create a space between two elements. Similarly, when you move to the inner value, you have a border of your element, and then you can specify the content of your element, such as this is the content, and then you specify the padding that your content must be far away from the border. So you can control these elements using the border attributes. You can specify the border style, colors, bottom, etc. And you can specify the padding, and you can specify different kind of paddings or margins. So if you want to study more, you can look up the internet and the W3 School for the Bootstrap, and you can use any latest version of Bootstrap such as Bootstrap 5. If you have any question, you can ask me through any of the designated mediums, or you can conduct a question and answer session on Microsoft Teams. Thank you very much.